All right, in today's episode of Whiteboard Wednesday, I'm going to be talking about the next two pieces that go very well together. The next two pieces in developing sustainable programs, and those are volume and intensity. And the reason those two things are grouped together is because they have an inverse relationship. The higher volume is going to be, the lower intensity is going to be, and vice versa. So whenever we talk about volume and intensity, it's necessary to understand some of the differences between beginning athletes and more advanced athletes. And one of the biggest ones, and I wrote an article about this actually, is neuromuscular efficiency. So for beginners, they can't effectively recruit muscle fibers to produce force because they just haven't developed that neurological capability yet. Now for more advanced lifters, they're much more neuromuscularly efficient, which means they can fire more muscle fibers, they can produce more force, and so they can lift at higher intensities. So if we have a beginner and we have them do a 1-rep max, that's essentially useless because that's not really telling us anything because they haven't developed their neuromuscular system enough to produce a meaningful amount of force to the point where that test would be meaningful. So, and not only that, but we have to also consider things like form. So having a beginner do a 1-rep max, their form is going to be crap because they haven't built that movement pattern, they haven't developed the musculature, they haven't developed the neuromuscular efficiency to be able to perform that movement at a higher intensity with good form. And so that has to be, you have to build a base with volume at lower intensities, get lots of reps in so that they develop that movement pattern, they develop some of the neuromuscular efficiency. So with beginners, when we talk about volume, it's not necessarily overall volume. In some cases, more advanced athletes are going to perform vastly greater amounts of volume, total volume, than beginners. But if we're talking about, say, sets and reps, for beginners, sets are typically going to be fairly low because they need to accomplish more movements over the course of a workout. They may have 8 to 10 movements over the course of a workout, and we're talking about strength workouts, of course, not even mixed modal conditioning or anything like that. So fewer sets, but more reps. So 10, 15, 20 reps sometimes for each set, and maybe 1 or 2 sets. Intensity obviously is going to be fairly low because the reps are going to be higher. Now, if we're talking about more advanced athletes, intensity is generally going to be higher. Now, if we're talking about rate of perceived exertion, that's going to be a little bit different because absolute intensity, more advanced athletes are going to be lifting heavier weights. They're going to be doing doubles and triples and singles. But RPE is typically going to be lower, so they're going to be leaving more reps left in the tank, whereas beginners are going to be working sometimes to failure or very close to failure because that's how you learn how many reps you have left in the tank. That's how you build self-awareness. That's how you build maturity under the bar, or even if we're not talking about barbell movements, that's how you just build self-awareness with any sort of physical capacity. So if you have to work and push towards that limit as a beginner, and that's something you can do as a beginner because you won't be able to tax your body enough to seriously affect recovery. Whereas if an advanced athlete is doing some very high intensity work and working at high RPEs and working to failure, that is seriously going to stress their body, and it's going to be very, very difficult on recovery. So applying some of those principles for advanced athletes, write this down. You want to think about higher intensity. So thinking about doubles, triples, singles, things like that. We want to think about higher overall volume. We want to think about less movements because they're going to have more specific things to focus on for their goals or their sport, whereas beginners need to work on a lot of different things and build a broad base. Less movements. And I'm also going to say lower RPE. Lower RPE. More reps left in the tank. For beginners, here, we want to think about low sets, high reps, low intensity, high RPE, and more movements. And these are just some of the differences that we have to consider when programming. Obviously, for intermediate lifters, it's going to be all over the place, and it's typically somewhere in between this. There's typically more movements. Reps and sets are typically going to be in kind of a middle ground. RPEs are still going to be fairly high for a lot of intermediate lifters, and intensity can definitely be ramped up. So it's going to be essentially a perfect middle ground between these two areas, which is why I'm not going to build a specific column just for that. But these are just some of the things that allow us to create sustainable programming. Obviously, it's going to vary from individual to individual in terms of what that program actually looks like, but these are just some things to keep in mind to prevent things like overtraining. If you have a beginner and you're having them do a lot of high intensity lifting, if you're having them work in doubles and singles, that's going to more likely cause an injury. Likewise, if you have an advanced lifter who's always doing 9s and 10s and RPE working to failure, you're more likely to have an injury there as well. So keeping some of these principles in mind allows us to create sustainable programming over time, and it gives us kind of a progression to work towards from beginning to advanced, as someone's training age increases. And so these are just some of the things that we like to keep in mind when designing programs. And so if you're interested in comprehensive strength programming, feel free to shoot us an email. You can go to our website. We have a contact page there. You can email me directly at jonathan@comprehensivestrength.com, and we'll see you in the next video.